The day usually started so mundanely that all that clock in the kitchen ticked away reluctantly, and everything seemed safe in its slowness, as if the world had agreed to give them a break for a moment. But towards evening, when the city outside the window was taking on twilight colors and the rain creaked on the windowsills as if someone had burned himself and was trying to scrub away all the next day's thoughts with a metal brush, Thomas, without putting on his coat, told his mother that he needed some fresh air and that he would be back by 10, after which he nodded to Jessie on the phone, where she had removed the small video call icon, and gave a long, almost humorous tirade about how he would only be gone for a minute because he wanted to finish the job he had promised to finish yesterday, and that there was no point in dramatizing it, because in this area even the cats knew the sound of his shoes and always backed away when they heard him coming down the porch, and his mother, standing by the stove, where carefully put down the kettle, turned away so that he could not see how her hands trembled, and said at length and with the same conciliatory tenderness that always protected him from the blows of the world, that the night, although familiar, answered only to itself, not to us, and that she probably would not fall asleep until she heard the key in the lock, to which he, smiling with his voice rather than his eyes, answered carelessly, but with a very long sentence in which all the promises of the world once again seemed easy and fulfilled, and then pulled his hood up and went out into the damp darkness, taking with him the unsaid. The city breathed rain, the sidewalks shone under the streetlights like cold mirrors in which no one wanted to look at their own reflection for long, and even the cars seemed to whisper with their wheels so as not to wake up what was sleeping behind the horns, and when Thomas disappeared around the first bend, everything remained in its place. The kitchen clock wearily ticked off, the kettle started its own song, Mom fixed the cup and, unable to resist, wrote him a message that she had brewed a chanterelle in the tea, the one he always called happiness with the smell of childhood, and that it would not return before, because the rain was becoming annoying, and after waiting for the 2 blue lines of the reading, she felt strangely calm, as if 2 small lines could guarantee a return, while Jessie, meanwhile, sat in her room, listening to the old song that they had once called theirs together, and tried not to press the phone to her heart every time it flashed with a new notification, because she felt that any unnecessary feeling could wake up the one that sleeps better. There were 6 minutes left until 10 when a spoon fell from the kitchen shelf, and this innocent sound, cutting through space, suddenly turned into a call to anxiety, because it was at this moment that Thomas's mother lost faith in herself, as if someone invisible had imperceptibly pressed a lever that turns off trust in the familiar, and she dialed his number, stretching out each ring as if she wanted to stop the time between them. And in response she heard only that indifferent musical opening of the operator, which always sounds like an excuse for everyone who did not pick up the phone, and she, unable to bear it, wrote another short, but due to coma and deferred hopes, a stretched message about the umbrella and that the hood did not save from the howling wind on the corner of their street, and that he should take something warmer, but the blue lines did not appear again, and this simple fact suddenly acquired the weight of metal. Jessie, noticing that his avatar in the chat had frozen, as if someone had taken out the last battery, called her herself and, not hearing the voice that always answered the phone with a smile when it was completely unfunny, began to speak a long, desperate, breathless phrase, which included reminders of the promises and the fact that they finally had tomorrow to go to the river, and that he dared not turn, for a moment, into forever, but the network responded with a cliff. So much silence fell into the room that it made her recoil, as from a wave that had suddenly gone too far, and then, hiding the tremor in her voice, she called Thomas's mother, who said in the tone that always gathered people together, that she would throw on her coat and come out to meet him, although they did not yet know where exactly to go, except in the direction where the street twisted and disappeared under the bridge. They met in the middle of the rain, when the lanterns turned the drops into a swarm of tiny ghosts, and they walked along the path he always took to return home, calling it the path for those who do not like light, and in every puddle it seemed to them that they could see the traces of his footsteps. The water had simply covered them with a transparent film, and that if they had only let the wave unfold, and from under it, his smiling recklessness was visible. However, the bridge was silent, the gates only echoed with their questions, and the window of the shop on the corner reflected 2 figures bent with anxiety, as if copies lived inside them, who also wanted to find something but could not find anything. The policeman they did stop at the intersection spoke in whole constructions of instructions and procedures, suggested writing a statement, waiting 24 hours, because an adult has the right to be absent, and these words, with their most pedantic logic, struck more painfully than silence, because it turned out that laws have patience, but hearts do not, and Thomas's mother, without raising her voice, but with that stubbornness that makes nails stand up, gave a long, even, inevitable speech about how her son always warns, that he knows how the sound of a key in a lock keeps her in the world, and that the absence of this sound is not his right, but is an obvious signal of danger. But even this speech crashed against the side of the company car and splashed onto the asphalt along with the rain, and then they walked on their own, not because they wanted to, but because they didn't know how to do otherwise. Towards midnight, in the alley behind the old cinema, where the posters had long since peeled off and only bits of glue were visible from each poster rectangle, they heard a sound that turned everything upside down for them, a short electronic beep, painfully familiar, because that's what Thomas's recorder sounds like when you accidentally touch it in your pocket, and they froze, trying to find their way around in this labyrinthine acoustics, and step by step they reached the service door that never closes because there's no one to repair it, and behind it, on the first steps, lay a black box with a scratched casing on which he had once carved a small star with his fingernail so as not to be confused with someone else's, and now this star stared at them like a tiny spotlight that had fallen from the stage and no longer illuminated anything, only to show that the show had been on. They bent down at the same time, and the mother, pressing the recorder to her chest as if she wanted to stop her heart, pressed the button, and the world was filled with a hissing sound, through which his voice could be heard. Not that light, ironic, almost singing one, but a tense, strained one, drawn out on the exhale. He was talking about how, in another minute he'll be back, that it's ridiculous to be afraid of something that has already passed countless times, that if he suddenly doesn't make it, let them know that he loves them both in a way that clocks can't, and then the sound turned into a dull hum in which it was difficult to distinguish the rain from the footsteps, and a strange whisper appeared, the same one, neutral, emotionless, disgustingly calm, uttering a long phrase about a door that leads not to a home, but to the other side of the night, after which there was another hissing sound, then a knock, and after the knock, a silence that can leave a lasting impression. Emptiness. Jessie, clutching the railing of the stairs painfully, spoke as if she were learning to speak again, and each word flowed out of her like warm blood. She asked the night to give him back, promised everything that could be promised if the night knew how to bargain, and at the same time she turned to her mother, convincing her that this was not the end, that the recorder was not a farewell, but a sign, and that signs were not left by those who did not plan to return, and her mother, who had stood like a rock a moment ago, suddenly swayed, as if the soil had been washed away from her in the dungeon of her soul, but she held her ground and said long and evenly that they would go home, hang up all their usual rituals on the ropes, tea, a blanket, a light in the hallway, a note on the door, because sometimes it is rituals that hold people by the edges of reality when it is being pulled down. At home they placed the recorder on the table, like a lamp burning without fire, and they did not dare to touch the buttons, lest they break the fragile bridge that connected them to it, and outside the window the rain, tired, turned into a drizzle, and the city breathed a sigh of relief, as people breathe after a long cry, and in this strange, sticky silence, reminiscent of wet velvet, the mother, without sitting down, said not to Jessie or to the night, but to the very fact of his absence, that waiting meant not just counting the minutes, but remaining yourself where you could be rewritten, and that she knew how to write a check. The days after his disappearance stretched into an endless chain, where every dawn began with hope and every night ended with despair. At first it seemed like a misunderstanding, that he would soon return, drenched, with that reckless smile he always brought home when he was late. The police wrote everything down in their reports, promised to investigate, but their eyes spoke louder than any words in the first weeks. For them, Thomas was just another name on a long list, another case to be put on a shelf with a number and date. The mother held on for the first few months as if her strength could pull her son out of the darkness on her own. She called every hospital, checked every morgue, woke up the neighbors in the middle of the night if anyone heard an inexplicable noise on the street. She looked for him in the faces of strangers, in the boys who passed by with headphones on, in the shadows that appeared outside the window. She studied his photographs as if she wanted to imprint the image of her son in her own pupils so that she would never lose him again. Jesse lived between school, books, and endless dreams about him. In these dreams, he always returned, sometimes silent, sometimes smiling, but always unattainable. She woke up in tears, because she felt that her dream was much more real than the emptiness of the room next door. Friends tried to support her, but gradually they began to move away. Not everyone can withstand someone else's grief, which becomes a daily routine. A year passed. The house learned to be silent. Her mother stopped calling the police station every day, but she always left the light on in the hallway, like a beacon that would lead Thomas home. Jesse learned to carry the pain inside, because words no longer changed anything. They both began to live in a state of waiting. Every knock on the door, every phone call was a blow to the heart, because it could have been the same, but it never was. 3 years passed. They got used to his absence the way one gets used to an old scar. It doesn't hurt every day, but you only have to touch it, and memories cover it with a wave. Rumors spread around the city. Someone said they had seen Thomas in another neighborhood, someone on the train, someone even in a neighboring country. But every time they ran after these traces, everything fell apart, leaving them alone with new disappointment. It began to seem to their mother that perhaps he was no longer among the living. She even allowed herself to say it out loud once, but Jesse rushed at her with a scream, accusing her of wanting to bury him while he was still alive. Their argument lasted a long night, where every word was like a knife, but in the morning they drank tea in silence and understood. This war between them was not because of hatred, but because of love, which burned in each of them in its own way. 5 years dragged on like a long winter. And then one rainy evening, when the mother had almost learned not to look out the window every time she heard footsteps, there was finally a knock on the door. Her heart stopped, Jesse froze, and both of them approached the threshold at the same time. The door creaked, and there he stood on the threshold. Thomas. The same, and at the same time completely different. His face seemed to turn to stone, his eyes darkened, the youthful courage disappeared from them, and instead a shadow appeared that weighed more than words. To their screams, tears and questions, he answered with a short, almost cut-off phrase. "I'm back. But don't ask where I've been." In that moment, they realized they had been waiting 5 years for the wrong guy who had left that night. Standing before them was someone who had been through hell, and hell now lived in his eyes. The rain had been falling for the second day. The drops beat against the windows, turning them into trembling screens through which the world seemed blurred, as if in a dream. Mother sat in the kitchen with a cup of black tea, cold even before she had time to take the first sip. Jessie leaned against the window, listening to the rhythm of the rain and trying to convince herself that this sound was soothing, although in reality it resembled an endless countdown. And suddenly, a knock. Unexpected, quiet, but such that it made their hearts stumble. They looked at each other, and no words were needed. Both understood, it was not a neighbor, not the postman. There was something familiar in this knock, like an echo of that distant evening. The door creaked, and he stood on the threshold. Thomas. A silhouette in a dark cloak, raindrops dripping down his hair, his face haggard, pointed, as if carved by time and pain. His eyes, they were the same bright eyes they remembered, but there was something else hidden in them now, shadows that could not be seen, only felt. His mother cried out and rushed to him, hugged him as if she were afraid he would disappear if she let go. Jessie stood still, paralyzed by the contrast between the image she had worn in her dreams and the one who stood before her now. He did not smile, did not cry, did not respond to their words. He only said in a hoarse voice, "I'm back." "Where have you been?" his mother exclaimed, trembling with tears. "God, Thomas, we've been looking for you everywhere." "Don't ask," he answered shortly, looking at the floor. "You're better off not knowing." Silence fell over the room. Only the rain continued to beat against the window, as if emphasizing his words. The first hours after his return had been like a nightmare that had taken on physical form. They tried to feed him, to put him at the table, to warm him with a blanket. But he sat like a stone, eating silently, moving cautiously, as if his body remembered other people's rules and habits that didn't belong here. "You're our Thomas," Jessie whispered, sitting down next to him. "Are you really here?" He looked up at her, and her heart sank. There was too much darkness in those eyes for her brother. Too much for the boy who had once laughed at her stupid jokes for hours. "I'm here," he replied. "But not the one you remember." At night, his mother couldn't sleep. She kept going out into the hallway to check if he was really asleep in his room. And when she looked in, she saw that he wasn't asleep. Thomas was sitting on the bed, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. She wanted to go over, but she stopped. Something about his posture, his depressed silence, was repulsive. Jessie also woke up to a strange sound. She went out into the hallway and saw her brother walking slowly around the room, his fists clenched until they were bleeding. She quietly opened the door and whispered, "Thomas, what happened to you?" He turned around sharply, his face burning with pain and anger at the same time. "I told you not to ask. If I tell you, it will be worse for you." Jessie stepped back, frightened by how foreign his voice sounded. He was not only her brother, but also a man who brought with him something invisible and dangerous. The next few days were a test. During the day, Thomas tried to behave as usual. He helped his mother, talked to Jessie, even went out into the yard. But there was caution in his movements, like a man waiting for danger around every corner. At night, he would wake up from screams, throw pillows, and cover himself with a blanket as if he were hiding from someone. One evening, Jessie couldn't stand it. "You can't be so silent, Thomas. We lived in hell for 5 years, not knowing if you were alive, and now you're here and acting like we're strangers." He was silent for a long time, looking into the darkness. And finally he said, "I came back because I had to. But I don't belong in this house anymore. I left a part of myself there. And they can come for the rest." These words made Jess feel cold inside. She realized that the true return had not yet come. Their Thomas remained there, in that darkness about which he had been so desperately silent. The night that followed his return brought no relief. It set up invisible traps of silence in the house, and every step, every breath, every creak of wood in the frame became a signal that reminded him that the peace here was now preserved, like amber with a fly inside, and Thomas, walking down the corridor, did not touch the walls, as if afraid of leaving prints on them that would betray him to those who read traces better than books. And his mother, holding the mug in her fingers that had long since tired of holding emptiness, spoke long, looped sentences with which she tried to persuade reality itself to be softer, that he was home, that fears should slowly fly out like birds from an open window, and that he and Jessie would cope with everything, if only he would allow their voices to enter those places of his silence where the alien command, to be silent, still lives. But Thomas listened, lowering his gaze, and in this there was no shame in the omission, only the memory of other people's eyes that did not blink, and other people's hands that could close the dawn if they so wished, and as if apologizing to the table, where yesterday there was a trace of a cup, he said almost breathlessly that he did not know how to return, when from that side a seal was placed on your whole life, resembling 3 circles inscribed one inside the other, and that this seal was not erased by water or time, and that their voices, no matter how much he loved them, did not shout over the rumble that grows from within when those who are accustomed to counting people like markers on a map bend over you. That evening the telephone in the corridor, old and silent, came to life, loudly, insistently, like an alarm clock on days when you don't feel like getting up, and my mother, clutching the receiver between her shoulder and cheek, heard an empty silence that was not the absence of sound but the clear presence of an intention, and this presence, slowly gaining strength, uttered in a low, indistinct whisper a long, even, toneless phrase about how debts like to talk without witnesses, and that the night is better than the day precisely because all agreements sound truer in it, and the name, Thomas, rang out there as if someone had touched a string stretched in his own chest, and he, not letting his mother finish, picked up the receiver, sucked in air and gave an answer that was not an answer but a capitulation of the tone that exists between fear and courage, that he understood everything, that he where they agreed that he would not disturb, that he had come not to hide in someone else's walls, but to give away what was still left of him, and his mother, deafened by his every word, rushed to interrupt this conversation with her own breath, but the line cut it off like scissors, and the receiver hung in the air, as if the pendulum of a metronome had been broken, leaving only the beat of the heart after the heart, which was now beating out of time. The first signs appeared after the second night. On the fogged-up kitchen window, someone had drawn 3 circles with their finger, so clearly and so confidently, as if they had done it hundreds of times, and the mother, wiping the glass, noticed that the outline did not fade. It appeared again and again, like a greasy shadow from the lost sun, and Jessie, who tried to talk to her brother not with questions but with stories that warmed up the cold in the words, understood. Someone had been here at night, or at least had been looking out of the darkness so close that their breathing had become common, and she, gathering all her fears into one long, rivulet-like phrase, threw it into his eyes that love was not a skin that could be removed when it got in the way, nor a toy that was hidden in a dark chest when strangers came, but a duty to be there even when it was dangerous to be there, and that he had no right to take her out of this, nearby, like a person from a stage where their common fate was being decided. The play, but Thomas, despite this fire, only shrugged his shoulders and quietly, stammering in long syllables, said that being close was sometimes the most dangerous distance, and that without her he could still divide into 2 piles what they wanted to take from him and what he was ready to give, but with her he couldn't, and that was precisely why he would have to take a step that would fester all the wounds, but perhaps, at least for a moment, would give the 2 of them the opportunity to sleep without someone else's breath in the room. He stepped onto the porch into a world of white, merciless light, and the shadows waiting by the car moved like mountains that suddenly felt like changing the horizon, and the first of them, taking her time, said in a long, cold voice that had no room for people who knew how to laugh, that the return was counted, that the silence was fulfilled, that only the last point remained to be fulfilled, which concerned something that had no name but had form and breath, and Thomas, swallowing the night like a sailor swallowing salt water, replied that the last point was something he would not give up, because the last point was their home, and that he was ready to return to the darkness, ready to fulfill any alien geometries, as long as these 3 circles did not overlap the windows where the eyes that he had carried inside him for so many years shone, and the shadows simultaneously turned toward the house, as if they were listening not to him but to the rustling outside the door, and the first said that agreements were the language of adults, and adults did not they confuse the concepts of debt and mercy, and that there will be no mercy, there will be an exchange, and that time is up, and that those who know how to wait are already waiting. The door behind him trembled, because his mother, unable to bear it, yanked the handle, and Jessie pressed her palm with hers, long, gently, not letting fear break the bolt, and the act ended when Thomas, raising his hands as if stopping the rain, took a step towards the light, where they demanded the last concession, which has the appearance of a heart beating in someone else's palms, and the night froze on the verge of a decision that would either save them or forever turn their names into rustling in someone else's files. The headlights cut the night into shreds, and in that light Thomas seemed not a man but a silhouette losing its own contours. His hands were raised, his face compressed with tension, and he walked towards those who were waiting. His mother, in a choked voice, shouted through the door that he had no right to give himself up, that it was better to fall together than to live with the void again, and Jessie held her so that she would not pull the lock, because she knew that if it opened, the night would burst in, and then there would be no room for any promises. "You took my years," Thomas said to the shadows, his voice trembling but not breaking. "You made me a shadow among the living, but there is one thing you will not have. My return is not your victory. I will not let you enter here." One of the figures moved forward slowly, and there was so much indifference in its step that it seemed as if it were walking not towards a person but towards an object. "We did not come to win. We came to take what was given to us by your silence, your life, your choice. It is not your decision, boy. The decision was made when you stepped into the darkness." At that moment, Thomas seemed to waver, but only for a moment. He could feel his mother's and Jesse's hearts beating behind him, through the wall, and it was his last source of strength. He took a small piece of paper from his pocket, the same one he had carried all those years of disappearance, and tore it into pieces, throwing it into the rain. "I owe you nothing now," he said. "If you want to take me, take me. But they remain." The light seemed to have dimmed, the shadows moved together, like a wave engulfing a shore. Jessie screamed, the door shook, her mother fell to her knees. And then everything was silent. No noise, no voices. Only emptiness, hanging in the air like an empty breath. When they finally opened the door, there was no one on the porch. Only wet pieces of torn paper clung to the tree, and 3 circles drawn on the step glowed as if they had been cut out of thin air. Jessie picked up one of the pieces. On it remained a single line, "When debt becomes life, pay with your heart." They never saw Thomas again. Only now and then, at night, the windows of their house reflected the light of the headlights, which had no car. And each time, their hearts sank at the thought, maybe he was still standing somewhere nearby, between light and darkness, protecting them with his absence.